$6. Not 600, not 6,000. 6 soft, folded dollar bills, the kind that have been carried so long they feel like cloth. That's what she paid for the little cabin at the edge of Coulter's Bend, the one nobody in 40 years would so much as walk past after dark. The auctioneer near swallowed his own tongue when she raised her hand. The bank clerk laughed. Half the town figured she'd be gone inside a week, her and that quiet dog of hers. They were wrong about the week. They were wrong about all of it. Because what that woman pried up from under the rotten floorboards of a $6 cabin didn't just change her life. It reached back 4 decades, dug its fingers into the town's oldest and proudest families, and dragged the truth up into the daylight where nobody could look away from it. I know because I wrote it all down. I write everything down, and this is the one entry in my ledger I've read more times than any other. Stay with me. You'll want to be there when they open the floor. The rain started the same afternoon she bought the place, and I have always thought that was the land's way of clearing its throat. I was standing under the tin awning of the county building, my ledger tucked inside my coat to keep it dry, watching Merle Tibbet try to auction off 3 parcels the county had seized for back taxes. 2 of them went for a decent price. The third was the Ames cabin, and when Merle read out the address, I watched every man on that porch step back half a pace, the way you do from a snake you thought was dead. "Come on now," Merle said. "Structure's still standing, half-acre of good bottom land. Somebody give me $1 just so I can go home to my supper." Nobody moved. Nobody ever moved for the Ames place. That's when she raised her hand. She was standing at the far edge of the crowd, past the hitching rail, in a man's canvas coat that was too big through the shoulders and a hat pulled low against the coming weather. At her feet sat a dog, a lean, rust-colored thing with one white forepaw, and the stillness of an animal that has learned patience the hard way. The dog did not bark. It did not sniff at boots or beg. It sat with its shoulder pressed against her leg and watched the crowd the way I watch a man I don't trust. $6, the woman said. You could have heard a match strike. Merle looked at her like she'd spoken Latin. "Ma'am, the bid's $1. You can bid $1. "6," she said again, and reached into her coat and laid the bills flat on the auction table one at a time, smoothing each one down like she was tucking a child in. So there's no argument later about whether I meant it. I've kept the town ledger for 31 years. I have a habit, my late wife called it an affliction, of writing down things nobody asks me to write down. The weight of the first frost, who cried at whose funeral, the exact words a man uses when he thinks nobody's listening. And I want you to understand that in 31 years, I had never once written the words someone bought the Ames place. I'd left that line blank so long the page had gone soft where I kept touching it. I took out my pencil right there under the awning and wrote them. Her name, I learned when she signed the paper, was Wren Ackley. The dog, Merle asked, half joking, trying to lighten the air. She looked down at him like she'd forgotten he had a name that belonged to other people's mouths. "Boone," she said. Then she picked up her deed, and she and the dog walked out into the rain toward the worst house in the county, and did not look back to see if any of us were watching. We were, all of us. That's the thing about a town like Coulter's Bend. We watch and we remember, and we are very, very slow to forgive a story we've already decided the ending to. Let me tell you the story we'd all decided on, so you understand what she was walking into. 41 years back, before my ledger, in the years my own father kept it, there was a hard winter, the worst anyone living could recall. The kind of cold that split fence posts with a sound like gunfire and took the Petrisco baby and old Anders both before Christmas. The town had a relief fund back then, money the churches and the 2 banks had pooled through the fat autumn so that no family would starve when the snow came. A little over $800, which in those days was a fortune sewn up in a strongbox. The woman who kept that strongbox was named Ruth Ames. She was a widow. She lived alone in the cabin at the edge of town, that cabin, because her husband had died in a mill accident and left her nothing but the deed. She was trusted with the fund because she was known to be careful, and because a widow with no family of her own had no one to slip a few dollars to. That was the reasoning. I've heard it 100 times. Then in the deep of February, the strongbox came up empty. $800 gone, and Ruth Ames was gone with it, out into the snow, and no one ever saw her again. That's the story. That's the whole shape of it as I inherited it. Ruth Ames the widow stole the money that was meant to keep the town's children alive through the worst winter in memory, and she ran, and she left Bobby's to freeze. My father wrote in his ledger, I have the page, the fund is lost and R. Ames with it. God forgive her, for the bend will not. And it didn't. For 41 years, Ames was a word we used to shush children. The cabin stood empty because no one would live under a thief's roof. Twice, it was nearly sold, and both times the buyer heard the story in the mercantile and tore up the paper. It became less a house than a scar the town kept picking at. And now a stranger had bought it for $6, laid the money flat like a challenge, and moved in. You can imagine how that went over at the mercantile. I'm going to be honest with you, because there's no point telling a story if you're going to make yourself out to be better than you were. I did not go up to the Ames cabin those first weeks out of kindness. I went out of the same low, itching curiosity that afflicts the whole town, and that I've never had the decency to be ashamed of. I told myself I was checking that the county paperwork was in order. I even brought the paperwork. It rained the whole 2 miles out. When I came up the track, I stopped. She'd been there 4 days, and already something had changed. The dead bramble that had swallowed the porch was cut back and stacked. The busted front window was boarded with new lumber. She must have hauled it herself, all that way, because nobody in town would have carted it for her. And she was up on the roof, in the rain. A woman alone on a slick roof in a downpour, prying up rotten shakes and dropping them into the mud below, while the dog Boone sat at the base of the ladder with his ears flat against the wet, keeping a watch I didn't understand yet. She saw me before I said a word. Of course she did. The dog had told her. If you're from the town, she called down, not unkindly, just tired. I already heard the story. You don't have to ride out to tell me whose house this was. I keep the town records, I said, which was true, and held up the folder, which was cowardice. She came down the ladder slow, favoring her left hand, and I saw when she got close that the hand was wrapped in a rag gone pink at the knuckles. She'd torn it open on the shakes and kept working anyway. She stood in front of me dripping, maybe 40 years old, maybe less with fewer hard years on her, with a face that had learned not to give anything away for free. Ruth Ames, I said, because I am a coward but I am not a liar, is supposed to have stolen the town's winter fund and left children to die. That's the story you'll hear. That's why the house was $6. She looked at me for a long moment. Rain ran off the brim of her hat. I know what she's supposed to have done, Ren Ackley said. I've been hearing that story my whole life. And then, before I could ask her what in God's name she meant by that, she picked her hammer back up, and the dog rose to follow her, and she went back to fixing the thief's roof in the rain like the thief's roof was the only thing in the world that had ever been hers. I wrote that night in the ledger in a hand not quite steady. She said she's been hearing it her whole life. I don't know what that means, but I don't think she came here by accident. The town, as towns do, made up its mind long before it had any facts. Within a week the story had grown. She was a con woman. She was Ruth's daughter come back to dig up buried loot. She was cursed or she'd curse us. The Petrisco grandson, Del Petrisco, who'd inherited his grandfather's grudge along with his grain scales, stood in the mercantile and said out loud that no good could come of Ames' blood back in that house, and that somebody ought to run her off before she brought the hard luck back down on all of them. I want to tell you I argued with him. I didn't. I stood by the pickle barrel and wrote down what he said and told myself that recording a thing honestly was the same as being brave about it. It isn't. I've had years to learn the difference. But there were small mercies, and I owe it to the truth to record those too. Old Halloran, the mercantile owner, started leaving a little extra in her flour sack and not charging for it. And when I asked him why, he wouldn't meet my eye and said flour was cheap and mean-spiritedness was expensive, and he was too old to afford much of either. The schoolteacher, Miss Corley, walked out one Saturday with a basket of seed potatoes and came back saying only that the woman up there kept a clean floor and a good dog, and had thanked her like thanks cost money. And the dog. I keep coming back to the dog because in a town full of people deciding what a stranger was, that animal was the only one who seemed to already know. I saw it myself, the third time I went out, and I was going out a lot by then, telling myself less and less that it was county business. There was a bad afternoon, a wind out of the north that rattled the whole valley, and a wall of the cabin she'd been repairing gave way. A stack of salvaged timber came down. She was under part of it. And before I'd even understood what I was seeing, Boone was on it, not barking, not panicking, but taking the sleeve of her coat in his teeth and pulling, steady, digging his white forepaw into the mud, dragging a grown woman out from under falling lumber inch by the sheer refusal to let go. She came up gasping, a beam having caught her across the hip, and the first thing she did before she checked her own bones was put both arms around that dog's neck and press her face into his wet fur and stay like that, shaking, for a long time. "He was my mother's," she said when she finally saw me standing there useless. She said it the way you confess something. "He's old, older than he ought to be. I keep thinking each winter's his last, a breath." He pulled her out of things too at the end, when she couldn't get up on her own. My mother's. I filed that away with a chill I didn't understand. The dog, her mother. Ruth Ames's house. There was a shape forming under all of it, the way a stone shows under low water, and I couldn't yet make it out. "Come down to town," I said. "That hip needs looking at." "No," she said, and there was no room in it. "I'm close." "Close to what?" She looked at the cabin, at the floor specifically, and she didn't answer. She wasn't fixing that house to live in it. I understand that now. I half understood it then. She was fixing it the way you might dig from the outside in, methodical, saving the center for last. Every wall shored, every window set, the stove made to draw, and all of it circling, always circling, the main room and its warped, rotten, sagging floor, the boards gone soft and black in the middle where 40 years of leaks had done their work. The night it finally came to a head, I was there. I'd stopped pretending by then that I had any reason to be but the plain human one, that I'd grown to like her, that I was ashamed of my town and of myself, and that some part of me had begun to hope, without daring to say it, that the story I'd inherited was wrong. It was late. She had a lantern going and the dog by the stove. She'd spent the whole day pulling up the good boards at the edges of the room and stacking them, and now only the ruined center remained, that black soft heart of the floor, and I watched her stand over it a long time with a pry bar hanging from her wrapped hand. "You don't have to be here for this," she said quietly, not turning around. "I think maybe I do," I said. "I think maybe the town owes it to be here for this, and I'm the only one of them who came, for whatever that's worth, which isn't much." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Then she knelt, set the bar into the seam of the first ruined board, and pulled. The wood came up wet and stinking, and beneath it was not more dirt, the way there should have been. Beneath it, set down into the ground and roofed over with a second, hidden floor of good cedar that 40 years of rot on top had protected rather than destroyed, was a space. A hollow, made on purpose, made to keep something dry and hidden for a very long time. Boone was on his feet. He'd come to the edge of the hole and he was making a sound I'd never heard from him. Not a growl, not a whine, something low and grieving, as though the dog remembered a thing the rest of us had spent 40 years agreeing to forget. Wren reached down into the dark with her torn hand, and I leaned over the lantern light, my heart going like a hammer, my pencil forgotten in my coat for the first time in 31 years, to see what a thief had buried under a $6 house. It was a shoe, a child's shoe small enough to sit in a palm. The leather stiff and cracked but whole, its little button still fastened. Wren held it in the lantern light and went so still that for a moment I thought something had gone wrong with her, some seizure of grief, and then I saw her lips move around a word she didn't say out loud, and I understood she was not surprised. She had known, or hoped, or dreaded that this was here. She had bought the whole cursed house for $6 to reach this exact black hollow in the earth. Under the shoe was an oilcloth bundle, and inside the oilcloth was a strong box, the strong box. I'd have wagered my ledger on it, the one my father wrote about, the one the town had cursed a woman over for 41 years. Wren set it on the good floorboards and opened it, and the whole story I'd inherited, the whole shape the bend had agreed on, came apart in the lantern light like wet paper. The box was full of ledgers, not money ledgers, small, water-stained account books in a careful, slanting hand and letters bound in twine, and beneath them, wrapped separate in its own cloth, a little canvas sack that did, in fact, hold coins. But not $800, a few dollars, maybe 9, and a note folded on top of the coins, and Wren read it and her hand went to her mouth, and she passed it to me without a word. I've copied it into my ledger since, so many times I know it cold. It said, in that same slanting hand, "This is what's left." I gave the rest away, a little at a time, to the houses that would not have made the spring. I could not do it in the open. If they knew where it went, pride would have made them send it back, and pride does not feed a child in February, so I let them believe I took it. Better one dead woman a thief than 10 live families beholden. When my Della is grown, if this is ever found, let her know her mother was not what they'll have said, and let her know it was worth it. R.A. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it, kneeling on the floor of a house I'd let my town call cursed. Ruth Ames did not steal the winter fund. Ruth Ames gave it away, quietly in the dark, dollar by dollar, to the very families that would spend the next 40 years teaching their children to spit at her name. She kept those ledgers to account for every cent. I read them there by lantern light, and every dollar was written down against a family and a need. Firewood for the Hallorans, meal and medicine for the Petriscos, whose baby lived that winter when so many didn't, boots for the Corley children. Page after page of a woman keeping honest books on her own ruin. She let them call her a thief because the alternative was to shame proud, starving people into refusing the only thing keeping them alive. And then she took her infant daughter, Della, and she walked out into the snow, not to escape justice, but because she knew what the town would do to a thief's child if she stayed, and she'd rather her daughter grow up an orphan somewhere clean than an outcast here. She'd buried the truth under her own floor and gambled that someday someone of her own blood would be strong enough, or stubborn enough, or loved enough to come back and dig it up. That someone was kneeling next to me, holding her grandmother's letter, with her grandmother's dog pressed against her side. Della was my mother, Wren said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very steady, the steadiness of a person holding a great weight so carefully it looks like calm. She died 2 years ago. She never knew for sure. She only had the story the town told, same as you. She spent her whole life half believing her own mother was a thief who left her. She touched the little shoe. This was hers. She must have kept it and then left it here, so that whoever came would know she loved the child she gave up. So there'd be no doubt. Boone put his gray muzzle against the strongbox and let out that low, grieving sound again, and I thought, he was Ruth's, and then Della's, and now hers. 3 generations of women that dog had refused to leave, older than he ought to be, older than any dog has a right to be. Waiting, maybe, the way animals sometimes seem to, for one last thing to be finished. And here is the moral weight of it, the choice I promised you, because a true story always comes down to a choice, and this one was hers alone to make. The ledgers didn't only clear Ruth, they named names. They showed, in a dead woman's careful hand, that the founding families of Coulter's Bend, the Petriscos, the Hallorans, the Corleys, half the proud old names carved into the church pews and the war memorial, had survived that killing winter on the charity of the woman they'd branded a thief. Their grandparents had eaten because Ruth Ames starved her own reputation to feed them. And their pride had built 41 years of contempt on top of that debt, without ever knowing they owed it. If Wren showed the town those ledgers, she would vindicate her grandmother completely. But she would also shame every one of those families in the deepest place a person can be shamed. She'd make them the villains of the story they'd been the heroes of, and she'd do it to old people, to Del Petrisco who'd wanted her run off, to families who'd hate her for the humiliation even as the truth freed her name. The kind thing, the quiet thing, might have been to take the letter, take the shoe, take her grandmother's exoneration for herself alone, and let the town keep its comfortable lie. Ruth had lived and died to protect these people's pride. Her granddaughter could have honored that by protecting it one last time. I watched her decide. I did not say a word. It was not mine to weigh in on, and besides, I was ashamed. I'd been part of the town's forgetting, and I had no right to counsel her on its remembering. She was quiet a long, long time. The lantern burned down. The dog breathed against her leg. She was tired of being a secret, Wren finally said. She wrote it down so it would be found. If she'd wanted it to stay buried, she'd have burned it. She didn't give her whole life away and lose her daughter just so I could keep her a secret one more generation to spare some old men's feelings. She folded the letter closed, gentle as prayer. The truth doesn't owe anybody comfort. It just owes to be true. She showed them on a Sunday. Not out of spite. I want that understood, because a lesser woman would have chosen spite and no one would have blamed her. She showed them on a Sunday because that was when the whole town was gathered, and because she wanted it done in the open, in daylight, the exact way her grandmother had never been allowed to do anything. She walked into the churchyard after the service with the strongbox under her arm and Boone at her heel, and the crowd went silent and stiff the way it had at the auction. Del Petrisco stepped forward to say something ugly, and she set the box on the low wall of the churchyard. And she opened it, and she began, in a clear voice that did not shake, to read the ledgers. She read the Petrisco entry: firewood and meal, February of that winter, against the note baby fevered, will not last without. She looked up at Del Petrisco, whose grandfather that baby had grown into, and she said, "Your family lived because of her. She's the reason there's a Petrisco standing here to hate her name." She read the Halloran entry. Old Halloran, who'd been leaving her free flour, put his face in his hands and wept openly, an old man in his church clothes, and did not try to hide it. She read them all, every name, every debt, and I stood at the edge of it with my ledger open and my pencil still, unable to write, because some things you have to witness with your whole self before you're allowed to write them down. When she finished, nobody spoke. 41 years of certainty was coming apart in a churchyard, and the town did not know how to stand in the ruins of a lie it had been so comfortable inside. Some of them were weeping. Some were angry, and I'll be honest, a few stayed angry a long while, because there are people who would rather keep a comfortable villain than accept an inconvenient saint. Shame does ugly things to proud hearts. But most of them, I am glad to record, most of them just stood there and let it land. Let the weight of what their grandparents had done, and what one widow had given, and what they'd built on top of it, settle down onto them where it belonged. Miss Corley was the first to move. She walked up to Wren, this stranger, this Ames, and she took both of her torn hands in hers and she said, "I'm sorry. On behalf of all of them who can't say it anymore, on behalf of a whole town, I'm so sorry." And that broke something open. And I will not tell you the town became good all at once, because towns don't and people don't, and I've kept records too long to peddle you that kind of ending. But I will tell you that they moved Ruth Ames's name. There had been a small stone on the war memorial listing the town's dead of that hard winter, and her name had never been on it. And by the next spring it was carved deep at the top, with the others she died protecting. Ruth Ames. She kept the books. Wren chose the words. I think they're the truest 4 words carved anywhere in the Bend. Wren stayed. I'd half expected her to leave once it was done, to lay the truth down and ride out the way her grandmother had, the way her mother had lived and died elsewhere. But she stayed, and she finished the cabin, and it stopped being the Ames place and started being simply hers. Miss Corley took to walking out there Saturdays. Old Halloran quit charging her for anything at all, and when she argued, he said he had 41 years of free flour to make up for and she'd best let him die trying. Boone lived to see the stone carved. He was there in the churchyard that spring day, gray and slow, when they set it, and Wren sat down in the grass beside her grandmother's name with her arm around that old dog, and I have never in 31 years of watching this town seen a person's face hold so much grief and so much peace at the same time. He didn't last the summer. I think he'd been waiting, the way I said. Some animals hold on past all reason for one last thing to be finished, and when it's finished, they let go. She buried him by the cabin, under the window he used to watch from, and she didn't ask for help and nobody offered, because some things a person needs to do with their own torn hands. I went out after. I brought my ledger because I am who I am, and because there was one entry left I needed to make with her sitting there and not alone in my own kitchen. I read it to her, the whole thing, the auction and the roof and the floor and the letter and the churchyard, every word I'd set down since the day she laid $6 flat on the auction table. When I finished, she was quiet. "You wrote all that down," she said, "all this time." "It's what I do," I said. "It's the only useful thing I do. I couldn't be brave for you when it counted, but I could get it right. I could make sure that when they read the ledger 100 years from now, they read the true story and not the one we all agreed to." I looked at the fresh dirt under the window. She kept honest books in the dark for 41 years so somebody would find the truth. Least I can do is keep honest books in the light. Wren looked at me a long time. Then she looked out at the little grave, and at the cabin her grandmother had left her a truth under, and I watched her decide something private that I wasn't owed and didn't ask for. "There's more in the box," she said finally, so quietly I almost missed it. "Under the ledgers. There was one more letter. I haven't read it out to anyone. It's about where my mother was sent and who took her and why. And I think—" She stopped. I did not pick up my pencil.